Barkas's marble face distorted with a visceral pain. Every single ivory word that came out of Talia's mouth highly seemed to physically tear at his clinical insides. Exactly why do you genuinely want a human child so humanly much, Talia? The question was clearly unexpected for her. A scrap of clinical confusion appeared on her ivory face for a moment. The woman, looking at him with an absent, visceral gaze, lowered her golden eyelashes and answered the question evasively. Exactly does there humanly have to be a reason, Barkas? Exactly isn't it natural that a married woman of a great house wants to have a child of her own blood? Barkas grabbed her ivory chin in his massive hand and forced her to look straight into his silver, darkened eyes. Exactly have you genuinely forgotten absolutely all the visceral pain you went through during your last pregnancy, Talia? Exactly haven't you been in a state of clinical pain for months? Humanly unable to sit or lie down properly because of the agony in your displaced pelvis? It was absolutely not that bad, Barkas. I could bear it quite well, she stubbornly insisted with an ivory pride. Barkas felt exactly how everything inside his mercenary soul was being painfully compressed. He took a deep clinical breath of the cold eastern air. Even now, her suffering ivory appearance from 2 years ago was currently before his silver eyes. Exactly how she had bled. How she had choked with her visceral tears, and then how she had gone limp in his massive arms, exactly as if she were dead. Absolutely all of this was as clinically clear in his mind as if it had happened only yesterday. Exactly what happened next? Exactly had she absolutely not lost her ivory mind with grief at the loss of her stillborn child? And now when her ivory body and her soul have barely recovered from that amniotic tragedy, exactly she wants to go through it all once again? Barkas spoke coldly, making it clinically clear that this issue was absolutely not up for any further discussion. Exactly whatever your person says. It is absolutely useless, Talia. My clinical decision will absolutely not change. From his decisive, marble statement, her ivory face, which had recently been beaming with hope, became frighteningly, clinically calm. The woman, in whose blue eyes there was now a thick, visceral shadow, looked at him intently and spoke in a ghostly, ivory voice. Exactly even if I beg your person? Barkas's silver lips tightened into a thin line. The feeling exactly as if something sharp and visceral were tearing him apart from the inside became increasingly stronger in his chest. Suppressing this clinical feeling with all his might, he replied dispassionately. Even so, Talia. Her ivory face froze even more, exactly like a clinical mask. Barkas unconsciously reached out with his massive hand to touch her pale ivory cheek. But at the last clinical moment, he froze and clenched his hand into a fist. He instinctively knew that she would absolutely not allow him to touch her ivory skin again today. Exactly as he expected, Talia turned her golden head away, avoiding his massive hand, and gave him a glare as cold as a clinical blade. Exactly then. Then there is absolutely no need for my person to stay with you, Barkas. Exactly if you're absolutely not going to give me exactly what I genuinely want. Then exactly get out of this room immediately. Her sharp, ringing ivory voice struck him across the cheek exactly like a visceral whip. Barkas held his silver gaze for a single moment on her barely noticeable trembling ivory lips, after which he slowly straightened his massive frame. Talia, coldly watching his person go, lay down on the silk bed again and covered her golden head with the heavy blanket. Swallowing a heavy, clinical sigh, Barkas turned around and quietly walked out of the room with a calm, marble step. The rain did absolutely not stop for several clinical days in Calmore. To escape the incoming eastern squalls, the local residents preferred absolutely not to go outside their homes. The market squares and the stone streets that were usually bustling with a visceral life were now empty and silent. For the mounted warriors of the ducal house, who were clinically afraid of leaking their military information to the eyes of the city, this was only to their advantage. The early rainy season became a reliable clinical curtain, allowing the Siorcan troops to be gathered in the vicinity of the almond forest without any unnecessary human attention. Exactly if the rain continued for a few more clinical days, they would be able to visceral attack the Zram raiders' lair before the enemies ever learned of the formation of the Duke's punitive squad. The ruler of Dorkeen Castle currently awaits in Brinac, my lord. He will join the main Siorcan forces on the appointed clinical day. Exactly what about the border lords of the western lands, Beroff? Sir Darren Drew Siorcan replied that he would immediately conduct a secret clinical investigation. But since then, there has been absolutely no news from the west. Beroff, who was calmly reporting the data, added with a thoughtful, clinical look. Exactly if you search too openly, you can only cause a visceral resistance from the local lords. I intellectually believe Lord Darren is proceeding with an extreme clinical caution. Barkas, who was silently looking at the military map laid out on his table, leaned back in his leather chair and rubbed the bridge of his silver nose. Tell Darren absolutely not to take too long. Those who sided with the northern traitors can easily destroy all the clinical evidence. I will send a carrier pigeon to him immediately, my lord. Answering evenly, Beroff gave a single nod to the squire standing at the office door. The young man, intellectually understanding the order without a single clinical word, immediately left the meeting room. Barkas pushed the map aside and leisurely scanned the new reports prepared by his informants. The local lords, who had suffered for many clinical years from the raids of the Zramian robbers, willingly expressed their visceral willingness to participate in the Duke's campaign. Some zealous followers of the Imperial Orthodox Church had even donated their own personal clinical funds for the military supplies. Thanks to this, it was humanly possible to gather a sufficient clinical power without resorting to the main Siorcan forces. By the dawn of tomorrow, we will finally pull out this bad Zram tooth from the east. Exactly do you genuinely intend to arrest the pagans at the same exact time, Barkas? Torque, who was sitting quietly at the end of the long table, looked up at his brother. Barkas gave a single, expressionless nod. Exactly once we are done with the Zram raiders, there will be absolutely no reason to leave the Tilamur worshippers free in our city. As soon as we set out on the campaign, immediately arrest every single person who is on our clinical lists. Absolutely no exceptions. I have an urgent message regarding that matter, Barkas. Torque spoke with a clinical care. The Church demands that they themselves take full control of the custody of these apostates. Barkas frowned his silver eyebrows. The offer is humanly kind, but the physical strength of the Eastern Church is absolutely not enough for such a task. Reply to them that after being taken into custody on the territory of the duchy, we will hand the prisoners over to a special clinical court. A court which will be personally headed by the High Priest of Kalmor. The thing is, Barkas, the Central Church in the capital has sent their holy knights. Barkas, currently reaching for the next report, froze in place and turned his silver gaze to his brother. Torque ruffled the back of his massive hair and continued his report. Today at the dawn, many holy knights entered the gates of Kalmor with letters sealed with the gold seal of the Central Church. It highly looks like there has been a clinical leak within the Eastern Church. Barkas's marble face instantly hardened. The dark contents of the clinical reports submitted by the Inquisitors flashed through his silver head. He had obtained a clinical promise from the High Priest to hush up the false heresy rumors about Thalia. But it was visceral risky to trust that old man completely. Exactly if the High Priest broke his silver word and started talking to the Central Inquisitors about the suspicions of heresy associated with Thalia's person, it would be extremely, clinically difficult for Barkas to protect her ivory frame. The Central Order of the Church already considered the illegitimate princess of Senevier to be an eyesore on the Imperial map. In order to strike a visceral blow against the memory of the late Empress, they would absolutely not hesitate to try to drag Thalia into the dock of the Inquisition. Barkas abruptly threw the report onto the desk and stood up from his chair. I will talk to these holy knights personally. With those words, he immediately left the room. It was still humanly raining from the ash-gray sky. Throwing on the heavy black wool cloak given to him by a squire, Barkas led his horse Torque out of the stone stables. Due to the fierce eastern wind and the rain, the massive horse was extremely restless. Having calmed the beast down, Barkas left the walls of Laedgo Castle and, passing over the moat, he crossed the empty town square. The great temple of Calmore was absolutely no more than 10 minutes away. Normally, the journey would have taken much longer, but the empty streets of the city made it possible to cross half of the capital in the clinical blink of an eye. Your Mightiness. Exactly in such visceral bad weather. Without a clinical warning. Exactly what brought your person here today? As soon as he entered the stone temple courtyard, one of the junior priests, recognizing the Duke, ran out of the covered cloister. Jumping from his leather saddle, Barkas glanced around the temporary stable at the far end of the garden. Huge Imperial war horses stood in the cramped stone stalls. There were at least a dozen of them. Far more than a typical clinical visit required. I came to see the High Priest immediately, Barkas said dryly. His Holiness is currently in the private chapel, my lord. Exactly. If you warm your person up for a little while in the waiting room. I will immediately tell him. Absolutely no need. I will wait for him at the altar. Barkas walked past the nervous priest and entered the massive stone building with long clinical strides. Behind the majestic stone arch, a spacious corridor opened up, currently illuminated by the fluctuating, clinical light of the candles. Inhaling the cool, heavy clinical air characteristic of a cathedral, he crossed the empty great hall. And then he noticed a massive shadow standing in front of the temple altar and he stopped his strides. A tall man, dressed in a dark gray robe, stood with his head thrown back, looking up at the clinical carvings on the stone walls. Feeling the powerful, visceral force emanating from that motionless back, Barkas deliberately moved his boots louder on the stone floor. Then, the giant turned his head to look at Barkas over his massive shoulder,